As we've learned, I think, a low unemployment number doesn't by itself solve everything.
The government's Jobs Summit in September was meant to find common ground between unions and business. Both sides want to revive enterprise agreements, deals tailored to an individual workplace. They've been in decline for years, thanks to stringent interpretations of what's known as the Better Off Overall test, aimed at ensuring no one is worse off than they would be on an award.
It is critically endangered in highly feminised sectors like aged care and childcare.
Unions and employers agreed on subtle changes to make the test more flexible. That's been reflected in the government's legislation.
We'll make the Better Off Overall test simple, flexible and fair.
Far more controversial is a proposed change to allow workers and their union reps to seek agreements across multiple employers at once and to hold strikes in support of their demands. The government argues this will help low-paid feminised sectors like childcare. It would give unions more bargaining power, and at the time of the Jobs Summit, even the Small Business Council expressed some interest.
When we all agree that the current system is broken, what's the solution? Well, the solution is to start talking.
But other business groups are firmly against multi-employer bargaining. They fear it will lead to crippling industrial action and hold back productive and innovative firms. It's the biggest sticking point in the Industrial Relations Bill, which has been sent to a parliamentary committee due to report back in 2 weeks. Tony Burke is the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. I spoke to him earlier from our Canberra studio. Minister, welcome to the program.
Hi, David.
You've repeatedly said this legislation will get wages moving. I'm just wondering to what extent, how much will wages rise as a result of these changes?
Well, history said as long as you have bargains in place, as long as you have enterprise agreements, you're always doing better than if people are on awards. I think for the multi-employer end, the best example is to look at where it was tried, even with the logistical difficulties that are currently there. So if you look at the Victorian childcare centres that engaged in multi-employer bargaining together, and it was complex because the system wasn't really set up for it, but they ended up with wage increases between 12 and 16% for those workers. This is a section of the workforce which generally hasn't done well out of bargaining. And if you look at it from the perspective of the employers as well, most of the people who run childcare centres are early childhood educators themselves. They're not trained usually in industrial relations. So the only way they'll get the sorts of benefits that can come in productivity from a business perspective with enterprise agreements is if they're able to work together to basically have a consultant who knows the rules to be able to bargain on their behalf. But 12 to 16% is the best example we have. It'll be different in every industry. I'm not pretending to know the outcome of every bargain, but
that's what
it's not a bad example.
So childcare workers could expect 12 to 16% pay rises as a result of this change?
No. I've given you an example where that's what it was. And in every enterprise agreement, and it'll be similar with multi-employer bargains, that you get different circumstances in different agreements. But
so what about some other sectors?
The best indication.
What can they expect?
Well, certainly for everybody, every agreement ends up landing you above the award. So at a time where we need to get wages moving, we've already pulled the first lever. The first lever was the annual wage review, and that was the way to get awards moving and the minimum rate of pay moving. That's already happened. The next stage is to get bargaining and agreements moving. Now, it'll always be the case. I'm just
wondering what's responsible here, because as you know, the Reserve Bank has been expressing some concern about wage growth just yesterday. It doesn't want anything that's going to put even more pressure on inflation. So what level of wage growth is responsible?
Well, I think you can only repeat what was there from the Governor of the Reserve Bank himself, which is when you do the average across the whole of the economy, he said the anchor point, so it's not a cap, but the anchor point over time should be roughly 3.5%. And that's based on the Reserve Bank wanting to keep the CPI between 2 and 3%, and then presuming 1% of productivity. So you go from 2.5, you add 1% of productivity, you get 3.5. That's where that anchor point comes from. And so not everybody's going to get on an enterprise agreement, not everybody's going to get on a multi-employer agreement. But the history for a long time in Australia is we've been told wages are about to go up. We were even told that when unemployment comes down, that'll create the hydraulic pressure that'll just push wages up. Well, we've now had prolonged period of low unemployment, and that hydraulic pressure isn't pushing anything up because there's leaks all through the pipes with a bargaining system that's not working.
Well, OK, but even in the government's budget last week, it's clear we won't see real wage growth anytime soon, another 18 months or so. But let me come to this contentious element of your bill, the multi-employer bargaining that you mentioned there, allowing unions to negotiate across multiple employers. You've been talking a lot about helping childcare workers and particularly women in low-paid sectors. But what about other sectors? Will this apply right across the economy?
Well, certainly any part of the economy that already has strong enterprise agreements, if you're in an enterprise agreement already, you're not eligible for a multi-employer agreement. The multi-employer agreements, the way the legislation's been drafted, are for the people who are not already covered. So if you look at the areas that some of the fear campaign's been about, it's often been about areas that are considered historically more militant, more industrially strong. They're the places that already have enterprise agreements in place.
So you're saying it can't happen in mining, ports, construction?
Well, certainly construction, we've got a specific section there. That means it won't be happening in the areas covered by the construction division of the CFMEU. With respect to mining, again, you've got examples. It's pretty hard. Like you go mine by mine, you've got enterprise agreements already in place in most of them. So, legally, is it possible that you could have a mine somewhere where this was pursued? It wouldn't be unlawful. But it's not really realistic if you look at the success with agreement making that's already there.
Why not just clarify that in law? Why not just clarify that in law? Because the sector is concerned.
Well, no,
legally, under this law, it still would be possible.
Well, possible if they're not on enterprise agreements, but they are. And possible if you could pass a public interest test, which for various sectors would be harder to pass a public interest test. So, I think you can sort of navigate. If they've had to navigate this far to find a fear campaign, I think, which into examples that are really impractical, then I think it's evidence that where we want to target this legislation is exactly where it lands.
You did say in the speech when you introduced the bill that you wanted to ensure businesses competing on quality, innovation and on product and service offerings rather than wages and conditions are able to continue to do so. What does that mean? Should some sectors be exempt?
Well, the simple example was to contrast with areas where it's a race to the bottom on wages. So this decision would be made by the Commission when they're applying both the common interest and the public interest tests. So it's for the Commission, but in the second reading speech, I tried to make sure there was some guidance there. So it wasn't just the examples you said where people should be allowed to continue, but I then gave the example of where we would want multi-employer bargaining to be able to step in, and that was where you have a race to the bottom on wages. If you're trying to get wages moving, that's not the sort of competition that the economy needs.
Finally, given the concerns of crossbenchers who are worried there's not enough time for them to properly scrutinise this, are you open to splitting the bill, getting what you can through this year, or is it an all or nothing approach you're taking?
My focus right now is to work with the crossbench to try to work out, to make sure that I'm providing all the material I possibly can for the areas where they're wanting more detail. My department's been doing that. I've been personally involved in some meetings on that today. Secondly, where there are areas where tweaking the legislation in different ways would make a real difference for them, we're having those discussions and making sure we're open to this. If I can get it through this year, it means we can get wages moving faster. People have had 10 years where wages were deliberately held back. If I can move that forward as quickly as I can so that we break through and get wages moving earlier, that's what I want to achieve.
Tony Burke, thanks for joining us.
Great to talk.